From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
It's Election Day in the USA, with millions of ballots already cast and millions more Americans headed to the polls now. Let's take a look at the early data and what to expect tonight when returns begin to come in. Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We're joined today by my colleagues, columnist Kim Strassel and editorial board member Monet Ukwe-Barua. With the end of the 2024 election almost in sight, the two presidential campaigns are frantically trying to get their last voters to the polls while trying to also get a final word in. Kamala Harris on Monday was barnstorming Pennsylvania with events in Pittsburgh, Allentown, and Philadelphia. Let's listen to part of what she said at that last stop.
We know it is time for a new generation of leadership in America. And I am ready to offer that leadership as the next president of the United States of America. However, the race ain't over yet. And we must finish strong, and this could be one of the closest races in history.
Donald Trump, meantime, was in Raleigh, North Carolina, also in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and then in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Here he is at that last event.
We will make America powerful again. We will make America wealthy again. We will make America healthy again. Bobby Kennedy Jr. We will make America strong again. We will make America proud again. We will make America safe again. And we will make America great again. I love you. I love you all.
Tonight, Trump will be at Mar-a-Lago in Florida, while Harris will be at her alma mater, Howard University in Washington, D.C., for what the polls are suggesting could be a photo finish. The Nate Silver election model says it is as close as you can possibly get to 50-50. Sean Trendy, the election analyst for Real Clear Politics, says the same. The modelers are effectively 50-50. Our tipping point state average has Trump up 0.3%. Everything beyond that is a vibe or arguably worse anecdata. Kim, that's a fascinating outcome here after all of this campaigning, and notably also the small town of Dixville Notch in the northern tip of New Hampshire, which votes at midnight on election morning, has split with 3 votes for Trump and 3 votes for Harris. And while you can't read too much into the result in a small town like that, it is pretty good script writing by whoever is running this show.
Yeah, it's perfect. By the way, my also favorite end of that Sean Trendy tweet was, "No one should have any confidence. Sorry." Period. Which is generally how all of us watching this election feel. No one has any confidence. But the thing that I found so amusing about Dixville Notch was not just that it was split 3-3, but that either side could read from that what they wanted to, in that if you're a Democrat, you can say, well, you know, of those 6 Dixville Notch voters, 4 of them are registered Republicans and 2 are independents. And look, we are winning the day. But if you were a Republican, you could note that Biden actually swept Dixville Notch in 2020, and that in 2016, Hillary got 4 of those voters. So Trump's 3 vote total in Dixville Notch is the biggest he's ever had in Dixville Notch. Yet I think this is really close, unless, and this is my caveat, which I've been making everywhere, is that we base all this on polls. You just mentioned both Nate Silver's polling machine and the Real Clear Politics average. And so our assumption that this race is 50-50 is based entirely on our belief that those polls are accurate. They have not been accurate, not in 2022 or 2020 or 2016. So we don't really know what's going on out there, and we won't know until the end of the day. So what we have instead, and what I am saying, is a situation where the polls, which have not been accurate, are showing us at a dead heat, and take that for what it's worth.
The public will start getting a better picture of what's actually happening on the ground. The earliest, I think, is about 5 p.m., it looks like, when the first data is going to start dribbling out of the exit polls conducted by media organizations. Then, Monet, the first states, including Georgia, voting stops at 7 p.m. and we'll start getting ballots reported. But what's your expectation? What would you keep an eye on tonight when these numbers start coming over the airwaves?
Sure. I think that everyone paying close attention to the election has tried to identify some of the counties that have been bellwethers in recent elections and are going to give people a sense of the trend starting early. One of the ones a lot of people are pointing to is Hamilton County in Indiana. I believe they'll have results released around 5 or 5:30. And this is an interesting county because Trump won it by a very big margin, about 20 points in 2016. But because of a lot of move-ins among upper class, educated white voters just in the past 4 or so years, Biden was able to narrow that margin of victory to about 7%. So a huge shift. And those are a lot of the voters who Trump and Harris have been contesting over, conservative inclined, but drifting a little bit more towards the Democratic Party in the past few years. And so the margin in Hamilton County and other counties like that will be an early sign of whether Harris was able to start to make even bigger gains among that demographic of folks. The first big swing state to be called is likely to be North Carolina, or the first big swing state really to start reporting. Their polls close at 7:30. And so, again, that's probably one of those places where some of the more rural, smaller counties are going to be reporting early, which is going to show Trump ahead. And it's possible that Harris will start to climb back as we get results from Wake County and Mecklenburg County, where the big cities in the state are. But as people who have watched previous elections know, it's all going to come in dribs and drabs, and you don't want to be thrown off by watching those earliest results. You really have to buckle in and wait for critical mass of these votes to be counted before having a sense of where these close states are going to fall.
Kim, similar to your comment about Dixville Notch, each side seeing signs for hope and optimism in it, let's talk about these early voting numbers a little bit, because there's similar jockeying going on. And the total number of votes, according to the election lab at the University of Florida, as we go into Election Day, is 85 million ballots cast early. That includes 46 million early in-person votes and 38 million mail ballots returned. Though still something like 30 million mail ballots that have been requested and not returned. So those are dribbling in today as well. There are also some states that have more detailed party registration data that you can look at. According to states that do have that available, 16 million of these votes so far are by registered Democrats, 15 million by Republicans, and 11 million by voters registered with neither party. And then there are a handful of states, including Colorado, Georgia, Michigan, and North Carolina, that have gender in their voter registration data. So across all of those states, as of now, 54% of these early votes are by women and 44% by men. But Kim, I am skeptical about how much you can read into this because we don't have a great baseline. The last presidential election took place during COVID. That really was a disruption to people's voting behaviors. We don't know how many of these early votes are cannibalizing the Election Day vote. Those were people who normally would have voted on Election Day. And then, by the way, some of these states, including Nevada and Wisconsin and Michigan, have same-day voter registration. So in that case, we don't even know what the pool of the electorate, the size of the electorate might end up being, because people who are not on the rolls can show up and show their IDs and cast a ballot.
Yeah, count me as a person that has a great deal of skepticism that early voting will tell you much about how things are going to turn out on Election Day. And that's just a pure question of statistics and probability, because for all the numbers that you can see in early voting, it only is part of the picture. It doesn't account for what will have happen on Election Day. Now, I do think for Republicans, there is one undeniable good piece of news in the early voting, which is simply that if you have in many ways closed the gap with Democrats in terms of those early votes, and that matters because a vote banked is a vote that is for sure, and you don't have to worry about the potentiality of a snowstorm or something stopping your folks getting to the polls that day. So Catalyst, which is another outfit that looks at early voting data, looked across 27 states. Democrats have returned 37% of ballots. The Republicans have returned 35%. So there's only a 2-point difference. Last time, it was a 12-point difference. That's a huge change. And those switches are even more noticeable in states like Arizona and Nevada. Arizona, Republicans are beating Democrats. Nevada, Republicans are beating Democrats. And they've cut the Democratic advantage in Pennsylvania in half. Now, a lot of Republicans are out saying, oh, look how much urban and woman turnout is down compared to 2020. This, to me, is an example of taking a data point and not taking all of the other numbers around it. Yes, those numbers will be down because as big as that early vote is, 85 million people, 110 million people voted by mail or early in 2020. So there is going to be an obvious decline in turnout. Where that gets a little different is that it looks like some rural turnout is out. But again, that can be accounted by the fact that more Republicans are doing mail-in voting. It doesn't necessarily say what will happen on election day and whether or not they are cannibalizing that vote. Similarly, Democrats are crowing, look, 1.8 million more women than men have voted in these 7 states that matter so much. But we don't know how many of those would have shown up otherwise on election day. We don't know how many of them are new voters. We don't know which direction they're voting necessarily. So it's all interesting data, but I don't think it really gives us a huge clue as to how things turn out tonight.
Hang tight. We'll be right back in a moment. Welcome back. Another X factor that I at least find hard to work into these calculations is the presence of third-party candidates on many of these ballots. The Libertarian Party nominee Chase Oliver is on the ballot in all 7 of these big swing states. Jill Stein for the Green Party is on the ballot in Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Georgia, and Arizona. And then Robert F. Kennedy Jr., he is on the ballot in Wisconsin and Michigan. And notably on Monday, RFK Jr. posted a video message on Twitter saying, no matter what state you in, do not vote for me, which is kind of a funny message, Monet, not something that you hear from somebody every day who manages to go through the rigorous process of getting on the ballot. But who knows how many people who like Trump, but maybe like RFK Jr. go into the polling place and see his name there and decide they'd rather vote for the person that they like more, or ditto for Jill Stein, maybe among some of these skeptics or critics of Kamala Harris in a state like Michigan.
Sure. I think let's take those third-party candidates one by one and talk about all of their different situations on the ballots in these different states. I think that you haven't heard a ton about Chase Oliver speaking to the listeners this cycle, and that's because often the Libertarian Party candidate is among the most prominent, best established, best funded of the third-party options, but that wasn't at all the case this year. I think Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s candidacy kind of took a lot of the oxygen out of people who dislike the establishment and are looking to an alternative to both parties. And so I don't think the polls have reflected that there's really any possibility for any kind of Oliver vote that's going to detract from either of the two candidates. With Jill Stein, I think it's interesting. Most of the conversation around her has been in Michigan with a lot of these Arab voters who are dissatisfied with the Biden-Harris policy toward Israel and are thinking about making protest votes to signal how dissatisfied they are that Democrats haven't been putting enough pressure on Israel to halt their campaign. I do think that a lot of those voters probably will stay home. They have pledged to do so. Some of these organizations have said, by no means will we endorse or support Kamala Harris. But I frankly think that there will probably be a lot of late-breaking Arab voters in places like Dearborn who do vote for Harris in the end because she's much closer to their preference than Trump is. And when they see how close the polls are, they're going to want to say, we're going to take the safer choice. So you'll probably see a little bit of an impact, and Jill Stein will collect some of that protest vote. But I don't think it will be a decisive factor in swinging Michigan to Trump the way some people envisioned. And then with RFK Jr. himself, I think that most of the people who supported him are pretty high information voters. He was very big in the podcast world. A lot of people who get their news online, like his critiques of the public health establishment, et cetera. And I think if you were someone who supported him early on, you probably pay pretty close attention to his candidacy and his message. And so if you really share his priorities and were enthusiastic about supporting him, when he says, don't vote for me, you'll probably get that message. And a lot of those voters, I think, probably have already decided to shift their support to Donald Trump, who they think is the best second choice after RFK. And people who do end up voting for him in the end, I think probably will be doing so as a protest vote. And we're never going to vote for Trump or Harris in either case. And so we can't really say that that's swinging the election outcome. And so all in all, I don't think that the third party candidates are likely to have a very big impact. But with the margins as close as they are in some of these states, there's no getting around the fact that it could possibly shift how some of these states end up playing out.
Kim, to the point that Monet made a moment ago about not reading too much into the early numbers when the polls finally close in some of these states, NBC has an interesting write-up going through which batches of ballots are expected to be reported first in different states. So in North Carolina, for example, it says that mail ballots are likely to come in first. So there may be a blue mirage, because if Democrats are more likely to vote by mail, then the early batches of ballots may tilt toward Kamala Harris until those in-person votes on election day start being added to the tabulation. Pennsylvania is another example. I guess Allegheny County and Pittsburgh are more efficient at going through those batches of mail ballots. So they may have some mail ballots that come in first. Then some of the in-person vote will be added to that total. So the Republican candidates and Donald Trump may catch up a little bit. But then Philly may be slow in counting its late mail ballots. These numbers are expected to move around a little bit. And some of it has to do with the differing preferences of Democrats versus Republicans in how they prefer to vote and the slowness with which some of these jurisdictions count those mail ballots. So that, I think, is to be expected, though I think it bears repeating because that's part of what made people so suspicious when it happened in 2020.
And if you are a real election junkie, my advice to you is that if you're watching the TV returns and your only focus is on the number of how many total Trump votes are out there versus how many total Kamala Harris votes are out there, especially in the early hours, it's just not going to tell you much at all because of what you just described, Kyle, the geographic imbalances in how the votes are counted, size of some of those votes, and how much longer it can take for other areas to get their information in. The real thing to be watching. And sometimes the TV analysts will break it down for you. Or it's also possible, again, if you are one of those junkies, to go on to the Secretary of State's or electoral sites for the states. And you keep your eye on the percent of the vote that's in each precinct and then in each big counting area or county. Because when you start to get up toward, 70 or 80% counted, there are people that do this extremely well, and they sit in these back rooms for the network televisions and for the campaigns, and they're crossing things off on their list. But they will know when this precinct's done, that precinct's done, and they'll be able to do a calculation saying at this point, there is no longer enough votes out there to overcome the deficit that this candidate or that candidate has. That's when they can call the race. So if you're really into it and you really want to sort of go through the data tonight, that's the most efficient way to actually look at it.